I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. MessianicApologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for August the 20th, 2025. We have a somewhat longer teaching today. We're going to be covering the composition of the Gospel of Matthew, and this was specially requested. But before we get started, in yesterday's live stream, we had a little technical hiccup. This is something which is broadcast to a number of platforms, and the two main platforms Messianic Insider is streamed to are YouTube and X. And if you want to be sure to catch us live, be sure you are subscribed to Messianic Apologetics on either YouTube or X, because some of the other platforms, they automatically delete after a certain period of time, whereas YouTube and X, they stay there unless we decide to remove access. So please, if you're not subscribed to Messianic Apologetics, YouTube, and X, be sure you are. Okay, so let's get into our theology roundup. Our teaching on the composition of the Gospel of Matthew is taken from our ministry workbook, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic. This was released last year, combining our Survey of the Tanakh and Survey of the Apostolic Scriptures workbooks. It's available in both paperback and ebook for Amazon Kindle. All right, so let's switch screens really quickly. All right, there we go. The composition of the Gospel of Matthew. It should go without saying that the Gospel of Matthew is greatly appreciated by many people within today's Messianic movement. But there are many questions about who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, when it was written, and also its background and the original language of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I am not someone who is hard and fast about the traditional authorship for every single book of the Bible. I am small c conservative. Yet at the same time, I generally lean toward traditional authorship or oversight for most books of the Bible. So I would look at the Gospel of Matthew as a genuine product of Matthew, Levi, the tax collector. But of course, there are some details we have to sort through here. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, in the Survey of the Tanakh workbook, the intention of the workbook is for you to actually sit down and read the Gospel of Matthew yourself. Read through the Gospel of Matthew, keeping a journal log of people, places, key themes and events, and major scripture passages. So that's a very useful exercise, not just for Matthew, but for any book of the Bible, for you to get a good big picture idea about how important it is for God's people. Okay, the theological summary of Matthew, which is what we're going to be going through here. Approximate date, early to mid-70s, possibly into the 80s CE. Time period, the conception or birth of Yeshua to the ascension of Yeshua. Author, Matthew the disciple. The location of author, Phoenicia, Transjordan, Alexandria, Syrian Antioch, all debated. Target audience and their location, the Jewish diaspora, possibly Antioch. While Matthew is canonically listed as the first of the Gospels in the apostolic scriptures, there is a significantly large number of scholars and theologians who do not think it was the first gospel compiled, and that includes myself. Yet, while Markan priority is often now adhered to in New Testament studies, that's why in this workbook, Mark appears before Matthew. Throughout Christian history, the Gospel of Matthew has not only been extremely valued, but it has practically eclipsed the three other Gospels in terms of both its appropriation in liturgy and theological or spiritual examination. While teaching from the four Gospels does seem to be a bit more even among interpreters today, the Gospel of Matthew continues to be highly regarded and remains a key source of much instruction, reflection, and contemporary application for Messiah followers. An undeniable feature recognized by almost all readers is that the Gospel of Matthew demonstrates the most Jewish character of the four Gospels, and that the primary readership of Matthew's Gospel was Jewish. This is evidenced by the fact that Yeshua's ancestry from the patriarchs of Israel was documented, Matthew 1 through 17. The author did not explain Jewish customs or traditions in the text, which can differ in comparison to Mark and Luke. He made references to God as heaven or the kingdom of heaven, consistent with first century Jewish practice, which avoided usage of the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the author emphasized Yeshua as the Son of Man or the Son of David. The author wanted his readers to know, in no uncertain terms, that Yeshua was the Messiah and the anticipated King of Israel. In many ways, one can surely recognize the poignancy of Yeshua's word regarding the scribe who brings out of his treasure things new and old. Matthew 13:52, New American Standard, as Matthew was greatly reliant on the Tanakh scriptures and the traditions of Second Temple Judaism, and presenting his readers with the news that the Messiah of Israel had come. Numerous references are seen to be predictive prophecies of the Messiah, as well as direct and indirect appeals to Tanakh accounts, which are in some way informative of his life and ministry. These critical factors would not only have helped confirm in the hearts of Jewish believers that Yeshua was the expected Savior, but also would have aided in spreading the good news to ancient Jewish people who had not yet heard of his ministry and atoning sacrifice. There can be no doubting the fact that the titular name of this gospel is of Hebrew or Aramaic origin, as the disciple Matthew was originally called either Matityahu or Mattai, which means gift of God. It has at least been suggested that there might be a play on words between Matityahu or Mattai and the fact that various Greek terms for disciple, the noun mathetes, and to learn, the verb mathetuo, sound similar. Disciples being a definite theme of this text, Matthew 28:19. Matthew was a tax collector before he was a disciple of Yeshua, Matthew 9:9 and 10:3, being known in Mark 2:14 as Levi, the son of Alphaeus, New American Standard, and in Luke 5:27-29 as simply Levi. The name Matthew may have been another name he went by, although it is also possible it was something given to him by Yeshua. Matthew's profession could have easily given him the skills needed in composing a record of Yeshua's ministry and teachings, and conservative scholars have no problem accepting genuine Matthean authorship. One of the most widespread views among today's New Testament scholars is that the author of Matthew incorporated previous material from the Gospel of Mark, as well as data taken from another source in assembling his gospel. This main secondary source could have been oral or written. Frequently, it is proposed that there was a document of notes or records on Yeshua's ministry and teachings accessible, which in many scholastic works has been designated as Q, an abbreviation for Quelle, German for source. A two-source or two-document hypothesis for the composition of Matthew does account for how nearly 90% of Mark is repeated in Matthew, with additional information incorporated and expanding the message. While Mark's gospel was written largely for a Greek and Roman audience, which would have been more interested in the actions of Yeshua, Matthew's gospel was written largely for a Jewish audience, which would have been most persuaded by his prophetic fulfillment and teachings. There are various liberal examiners who question Matthew's authorship, as the author did not identify himself by name in the gospel. Greek copies of this gospel started appearing with the words kata Mathion around 125 CE. What is known about the authorship of this gospel comes from later Christian tradition, which ascribed Matthean origin, but also begs some complicated questions about its composition. The 4th century historian Eusebius detailed Matthew, also having first proclaimed the gospel in Hebrew, when on the point of going also to other nations, committed it to writing in his native tongue, and thus supplied the want of his presence to them by his writings. Ecclesiastical History 3:24-6. The statement, which receives the most attention among Matthean interpreters, though, appears a little later, when Eusebius relayed the words of the 2nd century CE figure Papias, bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor. Matthew composed his history, or Matthew compiled the sayings, in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone translated it as he was able. Ecclesiastical History 3:39-16. This one statement by Papias, which appears to have been repeated by some of the other church fathers and made its way to Eusebius, has been interpreted in various ways, some ways being rather misleading. D.A. Carson and Douglas J. Moo advise examiners how these words are, quote, notoriously difficult to translate, unquote, noting the different options. Quote, Matthew, Suna Taxeta, composed, compiled, arranged in an orderly form, ta logia, the sayings, the gospel in Hebraidi dialecto, the Hebrew Aramaic language, Hebrew Aramaic style, and each hermenusin, interpreted, translated, transmitted them as best he could, unquote. From An Introduction to the New Testament. Controversy over the composition of Matthew's gospel ensues over what Papias meant by saying that Matthew either compiled or assembled ta logia, as logion is generally a Greek term for sayings or oracles. Noted with the further description in the Hebrew dialect, Hebraidi dialecto. There are 4 basic ways in which Eusebius's words can be viewed. Number 1, a complete gospel text was written by Matthew in Hebrew or Aramaic. Number 2, Matthew put together notes of the sayings of Yeshua in Hebrew or Aramaic, possibly what scholars propose as being the Q document, later to be incorporated into a final and complete Greek gospel. Number 3, the description, Hebraidi dialecto, is to be regarded as being a Jewish style of composition or writing. And number 4, logia could mean various proof texts from the Tanakh scriptures, Old Testament, which support Yeshua's messiahship. Conservatives will generally not argue against the disciple Matthew compiling a complete gospel on behalf of the early believers, which now bears his name. But how strong is the evidence that the canonical Greek text of Matthew extant today is a translation of a complete text originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic? There are a few modern Christian scholars who hold that the canonical Greek Matthew is an essentially accurate and early translation of an original non-extant Hebrew version, but such claims have been contested. More concerning, to be certain, though, are how many in today's Messianic movement feel that the canonical Greek Matthew could be a less than authoritative translation of an original Hebrew or Aramaic text, to be approached with a degree of suspicion. Various persons and Hebrew roots, though, may just say that the Greek text of Matthew is invalid. Textually speaking, any advocate of an original Hebrew or Aramaic written form for the Gospel of Matthew has a huge uphill mountain to climb. No ancient Hebrew or Aramaic Matthew from the biblical period or fragment of such a text has surfaced which predates the present Greek Matthew. Quote, no Hebrew or Aramaic collection of Jesus' sayings has survived, so its existence must remain hypothetical, unquote, from Anthony J. Saldarini. The Aramaic Peshitta, which includes the authorized New Testament for the Syrian Orthodox Church, dates from the 4th to 5th century CE and is widely recognized as being a translation from the Greek apostolic scriptures, although quite an early and valuable one. While there are various editions of a so-called Hebrew Gospel of Matthew floating around, they all date from the Middle Ages. The most popular of these is the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, edited and translated into English by George Howard. This eclectic version is acknowledged in its introduction as being put together from a Jewish anti-missionary work entitled Evan Bohan from the 14th century CE, originally intended to refute Christian claims about Yeshua being the Messiah. Among its various theological problems, it is also significantly tarnished by using the derogatory form Yeshu for the name of the Messiah. No worthwhile Bible scholar today at all denies how there is both Semitic linguistic influence and Jewish theological significance involved with the canonical Greek Matthew. Yet, there is no comprehensive evidence which should cause any faithful believer to treat the canonical Gospel of Matthew in Greek as being something secondary or undervalued. The present canonical Greek Matthew has no indications of it being a translation of an original Hebrew Matthew. Quote, Matthew's Greek reveals none of the telltale marks of a translation. Furthermore, Matthew's Old Testament quotations are derived from the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text. Unquote. Donald Hagner, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. If anything is to be noted, quote, the mix of text form suggests an author writing in Greek but knowledgeable in Semitic languages and therefore able to vary his form, unquote. Carson and Moo. Any Hebraisms or Semitic language forms used in this gospel and transcribed into Greek would most likely be oral or from secondhand notes, as, quote, the view that Matthew or any of our four gospels was originally written in Aramaic, though warmly advocated by several modern scholars, has been almost universally repudiated. The gospel traditions undoubtedly once circulated in oral Aramaic, but the written gospels are Greek books, and the basic source for Matthew and Luke was unquestionably a Greek work, the Gospel according to Mark, unquote. Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. Among a wide number of modern interpreters, Eusebius's assertion that Matthew wrote in Hebraidi dialecto, Ecclesiastical History 3, 39-16, is thought to be synonymous to, quote, in a Jewish style, unquote. McKnight is one who asserts, quote, the Greek expression Hebraidi dialecto, when investigated carefully, means not in the Hebrew language, but in a Hebrew rhetorical style, unquote. Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. This would make Matthew's Gospel an originally composed Greek document, which was sure to incorporate Hebraic sources. And as Eusebius noted, everyone who read it would have interpreted it as best as possible. This probably regarded not only how Matthew was understood by its original recipients, but also how it was integrated into other evangelistic and theological works. McKnight further details, quote, the most recent scholarship on the Papias Logion suggests that the traditional rendering is insufficient and should be understood now in the following manner. In contrast to Mark's unordered, Crea-style gospel, Papias contends, Matthew composed a more Jewish, orderly-style gospel. The original language then is of no concern to Papias. In all likelihood, our Gospel of Matthew was composed originally in Greek and in a Jewish style, unquote. Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. Viewing Eusebius's remarks in this way can be very healthy, as it enables one to favorably view the text of the canonical Greek Matthew while recognizing its Jewish origination and deep roots in the Hebrew Tanakh, Old Testament. This, in fact, seems to be the default position of many Matthean examiners. In our estimation, the two best options for Matthew's linguistic composition, given the extant textual data and the fact that no Hebrew or Aramaic text present predates the canonical Greek Matthew, are, number one, that Papias' statements either referred to Matthew compiling Hebrew or Aramaic notes, which he later used for a complete Greek composition, perhaps Q, or two, that a style of writing common to Second Temple Judaism was intended. The language question surrounding the Gospel of Matthew is very much contingent on the fact of establishing where the text originated and who its intended audience was. Saying that the main audience of Matthew was Jewish is entirely reasonable, but claiming that they were all Hebrew-speaking Jews, as many Messianics today will ardently exclaim, ignores the presence of an immensely large diaspora Jewish population in the first century, among whom there were huge numbers of Messiah followers. The main candidate city among scholars for Matthew's composition and initial reception is actually Syrian Antioch. Although, quote, other specific suggestions are that the gospel originated in Phoenicia or in a Transjordan situation or in Alexandria, unquote. Donald Guthrie. Caesarea has also been suggested as a place of origin. All of these places are notably adjacent to the land of Israel, but with the exception of Transjordan, they employed Greek as their primary language. Quote, most scholars today opt for Syria as the place of origin, unquote. Carson and Moo. Meyer is a liberal interpreter who, while leaning toward Matthew being composed in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE as a second-generation Messianic work, nevertheless offers some compelling reasons for Antioch being the place of Matthew being written and originally received. Quote, Antioch was a predominantly Greek-speaking metropolis with the largest Jewish population in Syria, It was the home of a Christian community founded in the late 30s. The Jewish tone of the gospel would have been reinforced by the sizable Jewish population in Antioch. Dialogue and debate with the synagogue are reflected in the focus on Jewish customs and rites, on the Mosaic law, and on the fulfillment of prophecy. Yet the gospel stands on the borderline between the Jewish and Gentile world. On the whole, Matthew's gospel employs better Greek than Mark's and uses Greek plays on words. Despite the strong Jewish tone, there are pointers throughout the gospel: 2, 1 through 12, 8, 5 through 13, 15, 21 through 28, 27, 54, toward the climactic missionary charge in 28, 16 through 20. Antioch supplies the perfect meeting place for the melting pot that is Matthew's gospel, unquote, from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. If Matthew's gospel was indeed originally composed in Antioch or in one of the other notable cities, then it points to a widespread Jewish audience in the diaspora, which on the whole did not employ Hebrew or Aramaic as its primary language. The likelihood of Matthew being originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic becomes even less probable if the gospel had been written after 70 CE and the fall of Jerusalem. Even though it is widely acknowledged that the main audience of Matthew's gospel was Jewish, this should not exclude anyone else from being among its first recipients. While Tanakh substantiations for Yeshua's messiahship would have been expected by ancient Jews hearing the good news, this does not mean that non-Jews exposed to the synagogue and to Israel's God would not have likewise taken interest. Matthew's gospel certainly has played an important role throughout history in helping to apologetically defend the validity of Yeshua's messiahship, and for much of Christianity in helping to bridge and bond together the Old and New Testaments. Scholars are not in uniform agreement as to when the Gospel of Matthew was written, as dates suggested range from the early 60s all the way to the mid to late 80s CE. Liberals have pushed Matthew as far out as the end of the 1st to early 2nd century CE. Much of the dating of Matthew is contingent on the fact of whether or not Yeshua's statement in Matthew 24:2 regarding the fall of Jerusalem and the temple was written down before Titus's siege or not. Those who accept predictive prophecy and are largely futurist and premillennial in their eschatology can accept a post-70 CE composition date of Matthew, especially given the text's likely reliance on Mark. Positing a post-70 CE composition for the Gospel of Matthew, possibly into the 80 CE, is well within the first generation of Messiah followers. The later that the time for Matthew's composition is pushed back, the fewer interpreters favor Matthew Levi, the tax collector, actually being its author. Theologically speaking, theologically speaking, the Gospel of Matthew can be viewed as the broadest sweeping of all the four Gospels, covering the most amount of material. Its content has been thought to be focused around 5 specific narratives: the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7, missionary discourse, Matthew chapter 10, parable discourse, Matthew chapter 13, kingdom discourse, Matthew chapter 8, and eschatological discourse, Matthew chapter 24. More than a few interpreters in the past have tried to explain these or some other 5 separate parts of Matthew as the author setting up a parallel to the Torah or Mosaic Pentateuch. While Guthrie cautions those who look at Matthew from a 5-fold division vantage point, noting how, quote, this suggestion is not without some merit, but is based wholly on speculation, unquote. The claim that the 5 central discourses in Matthew are intended to parallel the Torah has been used at times to support the idea that Moses' teaching is significantly inferior to the Messiah's teachings. Carson and Moo are right to conclude that limiting the Gospel of Matthew to 5 sections Paralleling the Pentateuch is problematic on the grounds that it will exclude key aspects of the gospel proclamation. Quote, few today think that Matthew intended any link between these 5 sections and the 5 books of Moses. Proposed connections are just too tenuous. The ties between each narrative and discourse pair are not always very strong, and any outline that relegates the entire passion and resurrection narrative to the status of an epilogue must be seriously questioned. Unquote. From An Introduction to the New Testament. Any reader of Matthew's Gospel knows how imperative it is to understand the Tanakh, Old Testament, for a proper evaluation of the text, most notably in terms of various fulfillment passages where one finds either a quotation from the Tanakh or an allusion to something within it, i.e. Matthew 1, 22 and 23, 2:15, 17 and 18, 23, 4, 14 through 16, 8, 17, 12, 17 through 21, 13, 35, 21, 4 and 5, 27, 9, and 10. It is notable, however, that much of Matthew's usage of Tanakh quotations is done so in a very midrashic style, requiring one to be very familiar with first-century Jewish hermeneutics. In Guthrie's estimation, though, quote, Matthew in his approach to the Old Testament differed from that of the rabbis in that he viewed it without being bound by a traditional method of interpretation. As a consequence, many passages are treated as messianic, which were not so treated by Jewish interpreters, unquote, from his New Testament introduction. The same can also remain true up until today, as various Tanakh passages viewed as proving Yeshua's messiahship in Matthew may not have been viewed as messianic throughout Jewish history from the fall of Jerusalem to the present. Yet, with access to much more Jewish literature and ancient sources, the strength of every messianic claim from Matthew should be considered on a case-by-case basis, with the Tanakh text principally in view. The Gospel of Matthew did not go to great lengths explaining first-century Jewish customs or traditions, unlike Mark, nor explaining the historical context of the events of Yeshua's ministry and sacrifice, as Luke did. When reading Matthew, one definitely needs to have a working knowledge of Second Temple Judaism. Much positive illumination has come in Matthean studies conducted in the past half-century or so, particularly with the greater exposure scholars have had to a wider array of Jewish literature contemporary to the first century CE. A familiarity, which much of this is now beginning to filter down to the average layperson, particularly via the publication of various study Bibles, even from a theologically conservative perspective, e.g. the 2005 Archaeological Study Bible by Zondervan. Today's broad Messianic community does tend to highly value the Gospel of Matthew, recognizing how integral it is for believers to view it in light of the Tanakh expectation of the Savior to come and redeem Israel. But while Matthew tends to be positively regarded, many Messianic believers and congregational leaders significantly struggle over the language issue of the text composition, often failing to really engage with a spectrum of opinions over the statements appearing by Papias in Ecclesiastical History 3:39-16, and with a lack of historical objectivity definitely present. At best, among many Messianics, this has led to a thought that there might be a scroll of an original Hebrew Matthew which will one day be discovered somewhere in Israel, while at worst, it has led people to think that the whole of the apostolic scriptures were originally written in Hebrew. The integrity of the canonical Greek Matthew is, quite sadly and most unfortunately, not highly valued in some Messianic quarters, and certainly in the independent Hebrew or Hebraic roots movement. This has led some to posit various interpretations of Matthean passages, which disregard the text as it exists in its final form. To properly combat this, Messianic expositors on Matthew need to learn to carefully respect the integrity of the canonical Greek source text, while at the same time masterfully demonstrate and expound upon this gospel as a first-century Jewish masterpiece on the Messiah and Redeemer of Israel. In terms of Matthew's theology, Matthew 5:17 through 19 are undeniably the most important and impactful verses for the halakhic orthopraxy of the Messianic movement. Our widespread conviction that Yeshua the Messiah came to uphold the validity and continuance of the Torah in his own ministry, yet with his interpretation of the law being the correct one, is surely controversial within the much larger body of Messiah. In much of today's evangelical Protestantism, Yeshua's fulfillment of the Torah is only thought to be in terms of its prophetic function and expectation, not that believers are to necessarily obey the, open parentheses, moral directives of, close parentheses, the law of Moses. Contrary to this, Yeshua came to fulfill Moses' teaching the same way as he came to fulfill all righteousness. Matthew 3:15. And this surely includes prophetic, ethical, and authoritative aspects involving our Lord's messiahship. Various theologians who propose that believers are to follow an independent law of Christ, Galatians 6:2, notably appeal to this being composed in Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And so today's Messianics need to probably make the extra effort to not only highly regard Yeshua's message in this teaching, but in expounding upon its definite background in the Torah and Tanakh. Not to be overlooked for the longer-term future of our Messianic faith community should be the role that Matthew 16:18 plays within our ecclesiology. Was it the Messiah's intention to build a separate ecclesia or church entity independent from Israel? Or, given the likely linguistic connections between Matthew 16:18 and Jeremiah 33:7 via the Septuagint, was this none other an affirmative promise for Yeshua to restore the assembly of Israel? A definite area of contention will be how to adopt a proper approach to Matthew 23:2 and 3 as it relates to the issue of Pharisaical authority and by extension rabbinic authority in Judaism up until modern times. Did Yeshua actually tell his followers that they were to blindly follow the Pharisaical or rabbinical leaders? A resolution to the various Matthean issues germane to the Messianic movement may only come with moderate voices able to control the future discussion, which was unfortunately not too possible in the 2000s to 2010s. All right, and that finishes our summary of the composition of the Gospel of Matthew. I hope that more questions regarding Matthew were answered than asked, but for certain, there are definitely things in the Gospel of Matthew that we as Messianic believers need to investigate in further detail. And we will certainly, in future studies and broadcasts, refer to other aspects of the Gospel of Matthew, other passages of significance. Once again, this teaching has been taken from our ministry workbook, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic. This is effectively an introduction to the Bible workbook, and it's available outreachisraelbookstore.com in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. Okay, so that finishes up our theology roundup for today. And just want to express my thanks for those of you who raised the question of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, before we get into our news roundup, got a notification during the live stream that one of the platforms we were streaming to cut off. So sorry about that. That is beyond our control. Make sure you are subscribed once again to us on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter. And of course, you can also get the audio version of this, the audio podcast, later when this live stream is concluded via platforms like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So, yeah, it appears starting tomorrow, we're just going to be broadcasting on YouTube and X. Yeah, that's the way things are. Okay, so let's get into some news. We do the news roundup after the theology roundup, partially because all of the news events we go through, whether it's the Israel-Gaza conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, whatever it is, it's always time sensitive. And things we see today can change tomorrow. All of the news stories I'm about to go through, they will be listed when this episode is archived later today on Messianicapologetics.net. You can go look them up for yourself, read the news stories, watch the little clips, whatever the case is. And before we get started, hold on just a moment. Having to open up something. Okay. Yes, the following articles and social media posts are employed in good faith via the principle of fair use, which allows copyrighted material to be used for the purposes of news reporting, teaching, scholarship, research, and commentary. Okay, so we got that base covered. All right, our first news story from Open Source Intel yesterday, August the 19th. Netanyahu in a sharp letter to French President Macron. The attack on Israel and the recognition of the Palestinians have fueled anti-Semitism. This is not diplomacy. This is appeasement. Your statements have made Hamas more defiant. So here you have the French government being chastised. You're going to recognize a Palestinian state rather than diffusing anti-Semitism. Netanyahu is saying that this is going to inflame anti-Semitism. And of course, along with that, one is reminded of possible echoes from the Second World War and the French Vichy government, which collaborated with the Nazis. Of course, could the French government, other European governments make this right and decide that it's premature to recognize a Palestinian state? To be fair, yes. But we wait and see what's going to happen this upcoming September with different representatives going to the United Nations. We know that some kind of a point event is coming with the Israel-Gaza situation, mainly because different countries, different leaders are growing impatient with Israel's ongoing war. And as I like to remind everybody, I hope every day one of your first prayers is, Lord, I pray for peace in Israel, and Lord, I pray for peace in Ukraine. Our next story from Rapid Response 47, U.S. Ambassador to NATO. It's from yesterday. We have a World War I type land war right now on the European continent. Nobody thought this would ever happen. POTUS, thankfully, was elected last November and has brought us to a position where we are possibly a couple meetings away from having the killing end. Now, I think this is a very useful comparison to the Russia-Ukraine war. Is it like the stalemate of World War I with its trench warfare? You pretty much had, the German line, and then the French and the British line, later American line. And, what is going to happen here? We're just going to end up, we move a few hundred yards this way, we move a few hundred yards that way. Of course, the situation between Russia and Ukraine is not exactly like that, but the comparison I think is valid. And the one thing about the First World War is, all these people just, if you ever heard the expression going over the top, well, that came from the First World War, when different soldiers would literally leave the trenches, go over the top of them, and then rush out into the battlefield, and too many did not return home. So, look, pray for peace in Ukraine. To be certain, there are a lot of emotions which go into this. I would be at a loss if we didn't mention how the second largest Messianic Jewish community outside of North America is in Ukraine. And then the third largest is in Russia. So, yeah, we know that a lot of things, should there be some kind of peace agreement, are going to come out later. But I agree with the president. If he had been in office, this conflict would probably never have taken place. All right, here's a post I saw on social media, on Instagram, the other day, from Noah Reagan. He's obviously a young person, talks about theology. And here he talks about how, if you are using Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, to support the modern day state of Israel, he actually calls this to be crap theology. And of course, he's referencing the interview Tucker Carlson had with Ted Cruz a while back. And he's saying, look, Genesis 12:3, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and you, all the families of the earth, will be blessed, referencing Paul's quotation in Galatians. That refers to the ultimate blessing of Jesus. So in his mind, you can't use this verse to support politically the modern day state of Israel. The challenge to this is that, of course, not only do you have many Christian Zionists who use bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, to stir support for the state of Israel today, it's also used affluently throughout the Messianic movement. Now, I'm not saying that Genesis 12:3 has been totally misapplied. We do have to take into consideration later uses of it to apply to the spread of the good news, and you, all the families of the earth, will be blessed. There are much better passages talking about support for Israel, support of the Jewish people, than Genesis 12:3. There are much better passages. And I take this kind of a post as a prompt. I even mentioned Genesis 12:3 yesterday on X, the Messianic Apologetics channel, about how, look, a lot of people, Genesis 12:3, it's gone old and it's gone stale. There are much better passages describing support for Israel, support for the Jewish people, and getting non-Jewish believers involved in it. 2 Corinthians 8 would be one of them. But we don't hear about 2 Corinthians 8 that much in today's Messianic community, do we? So we know that this, even if we're able to see some degree of peace and ceasefire and Hamas being pushed out of Gaza take place, the one long-term thing we have to deal with post-October the 7th is rising anti-Semitism, rising anti-Judaism, not necessarily among those on the progressive left, the progressive Christian left, but those among the conservative Christian right. And all I can say for the short term is the Lord told me, open a file, start filing things away, because before too long, you're going to sit down, you're going to get a massive download, and you're going to be able to address these issues and other related topics. From Visegrad 24, yesterday, a majority of Western humanitarian aid today goes to just 1% of the desperate people living under Islamic rule. While the world watches Gaza, 200 million Africans are left to suffer. And why do we not hear more of this? Is it because they're not Jewish? And some of this Gaza situation, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is in fact spurred on by demonic anti-Semitism. End time headlines. Members of Generation Z or Z are significantly less engaged with their churches than their older counterparts, according to research showing that those with higher levels of church engagement tend to have higher levels of flourishing and well-being. Yes, the fact that in some places church attendance has just plummeted. I mean, we can look at Western Europe for certain, but even here in North America, even in states like the Bible Belt, church attendance has plummeted, and that has affected the certainly psychological well-being of many people, because when you attend a worship service regularly, when you're part of a local community, you're engaged in disciplines such as Bible study, corporate prayer, counseling, whatever it is. Hey, what can I do for you? How can I help you? You are much more emotionally stable than those who just spend all their time on social media, looking at their phones and looking at the latest shows, among other things. All right, our next story from Fox News, and this has got a number of people really stirred up, particularly evangelical believers. From yesterday, President Trump said, I want to try and get to heaven. If I can get to heaven, this will be one of the reasons. President Trump responding to how President Trump makes a humble admission as he pushes to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, look, President Trump wants to do something honorable. He wants to stop the killing, Russia and Ukraine. And his observation is, I want to try to get to heaven. And so many people are taking this as, well, wait a second. Didn't Trump pray the sinner's prayer and accept Jesus into his heart? Is he instead talking about works righteousness? And look, I personally do not know the spiritual disposition of the President of the United States. I hope, especially after what took place in Butler, Pennsylvania, and I do genuinely believe that God spared his life. I hope President Trump is a born-again believer. I have significant doubts that he is. I do believe he is within the sphere of influence of believers, even people like Paula White, but he's in a better sphere of influence than many others in the government are. And like many people, I think his natural disposition is to have kind of the ledger sheet salvation. My good deeds outweigh my bad deeds. Thus, God has to get me into heaven. No, that doesn't work. But President Trump does represent a lot of people we all know and care about who they grow up in a religious sphere of influence, Christian or even Jewish. They do the right things. They try to do the right things. They try to say things like, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I need to do good things like, stop the war between Russia and Ukraine. And then in their final days, they realize that they have to make their peace with the Creator, and they end up getting into the kingdom. I think Trump is more or less on that trajectory. Pray for the president. From open source intel yesterday, August the 19th, Trump's take on Russia-Ukraine war. If I can save 7,000 people a week from being killed, I want to try to get to heaven if possible. I'm hearing I'm not doing well. If I can get to heaven, this will be the reason. Okay. At least Trump is thinking about his eternal destiny, where he's going to spend eternity. A lot of people don't. A lot of the European leaders he was with, they don't believe in God. Sorry to say that. Open source intel, just in, Israel, the Middle East situation, is moving ahead with plans to capture Gaza City. The chief of staff will present the plan to Defense Minister Katz tonight, followed by a meeting with the prime minister Thursday. An Israeli official said the operation will proceed unless a framework guarantees the release of all 50 hostages and an end to the war on Israel's terms. Of course, we do pray for a resolution to this conflict. Nobody wants it taken care of more than I think Israelis do. This is from yesterday afternoon, August the 19th. Rapid Response 47, press secretary. The president has definitely stated U.S. boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. Yeah, one of the ongoing, of course, controversies of what is the final Russia-Ukraine peace deal going to end up with? What are the security guarantees for Ukraine? And Americans don't really want American men and women, American soldiers in Ukraine. Open source intel defender yesterday, August the 19th. According to White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, Russian President Vladimir Putin has promised to hold direct talks in the coming weeks with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. And indeed, I hope that that is something which can take place. But we know this can definitely change. Axios, open source intel yesterday. Axios, Putin asked China to serve as guarantor for an agreement with the U.S. and European nations. Okay, so thus far, to just trace what has happened over the past week or so, Friday we saw a summit between President Trump, President Putin in Alaska. Monday, we saw a summit at the White House with President Zelensky and various European leaders, NATO leaders. Now, what's the next summit going to be? What's the peace agreement going to involve, perhaps? Security guarantees. Putin is bringing China into the mix. And yes, this is an editorial remark, but I do think one of the worst things that has ever happened was for the Europeans to push Russia into the Eastern sphere of influence, into the Chinese sphere of influence. That did not have to happen. From Open Source Intel Defender yesterday, August the 19th, during yesterday's call, so this would be Monday's call between U.S. President Donald J. Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, Trump reportedly told Putin that he will have to meet directly with Zelensky to discuss his territorial demands and urged him to be realistic in his concessions, according to officials who spoke to Axios. Yeah, so what is Ukraine willing to give up or not? And is that going to be what could cause this to fail? We hope that doesn't happen. Back to the Middle East, open source intel yesterday, August the 19th, around 60,000 Israeli reservists will begin receiving call-up orders tomorrow. So that's today now for the planned Gaza City offensive, pending Defense Minister Israel Katz's approval. They will have at least 2 weeks to report, with many serving as replacements for troops on other fronts rather than in the assault itself. And of course, anyone who has served in the military knows that these are the kinds of things which can and do change. But yeah, Israel's calling up different reservists for the next action. Here is an important post from Vivid on X, posting a short video by the actor David Schwimmer, where some of you all are probably familiar with him from the television show Friends, among others. Here he says, and I completely agree with him, stand with your Jewish friends and colleagues against hatred. Say that what's happening in our campuses and schools is unacceptable. Say anything in solidarity with the Jewish community. And indeed, some of this goes on and says, hey, you don't have to understand everything that goes on in the Middle East. No one is asking you to solve the conflict in the Middle East. But taking what's happening in the Middle East on every single Jewish person in the diaspora every single Jewish person attending a college, a university, they're just trying to get on with their lives. That is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. No different than, forcibly discriminating against every single Muslim person or every single Arab person who cannot be held responsible for every single action of what goes on in the Arab or Muslim world. From Open Source Intel Defender, August the 19th. This is from yesterday evening. Following yesterday's summit at the White House between U.S. President Donald J. Trump and several European leaders, including Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Trump called and spoke with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to discuss several topics related to recent talks with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. Okay. During the call, Trump reportedly asked Orban why he was blocking attempts by Ukraine to join the European Union, urging him to drop his opposition to Ukraine's EU membership bid, which is supported by a majority of other countries in Europe. Additionally, Orban is said to have expressed interest in Hungary hosting the next round of talks between Putin and Zelensky, from Bloomberg. Okay, so many of you all are doubtlessly familiar with Hungarian Prime Minister Orban. He is someone who definitely supports traditional European Christian values. He is opposed here Ukrainian entry into the EU. For many analysts, Russia sees Ukraine entering into the EU as a much lesser evil than Ukraine entering NATO. So I can definitely see that being used as kind of a bargaining chip, a point of negotiation and any kind of peace talks. Well, why don't we let Ukraine join the EU but not join NATO? President Putin, can you concede to that? I can see that possibly happening, but we don't know. And then some have invoked how a previous treaty between Russia, Ukraine, the United States, the United Kingdom, when Bill Clinton was president, John Major was the prime minister, that was signed in Budapest. And so do we want to do another treaty in Budapest, or should we look someplace else? That's too superstitious for me. We know all these things can change at a moment's notice. Okay, so we got 5 more stories to go through. All right, from Catholic Herald on Instagram. The U.S. Catholic Church appears to be entering a period of renewed growth, with the latest data showing that more people are joining than leaving. Okay, so why is the Catholic Church growing now? Presumably with not necessarily lapsed Catholics, but with former Protestants. This is the kind of thing that would make my 2 grandfathers really, really angry. Well, yes, you still have mainline Protestant denominations. You actually still have Protestant denominations which have more formal worship than not, with some kind of creedal declaration. You even have Anglicanism with different ceremonies which are similar to Catholicism, although definitely watered down. But a lot of young people who are going into Catholicism, they were raised in, although we can't speak universally, they were raised in a lot of these non-denominational, contemporary types of settings. And yes, God certainly works through contemporary, non-denominational, quasi-charismatic settings, but they want something that's more not only formal, but something which is more reverent. They want something which is more reserved. They want something which can connect them to the ancient past. They want something which can be much more focused on not only readings of scripture, liturgy, but something that's much more tactile, whether it's the Eucharist, i.e. communion, whether it's the Latin liturgy, whether it's the vestments. People see, value in that, and they see that Catholicism has many, many, many centuries behind it. And when your local non-denominational church, like the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex has got dozens upon dozens of non-denominational churches with some of the most ridiculous names. I mean, a name like Redeemer Church is fine, but a name like Revolution Church, not so much. A name like Game Changer Church, not so much. And if you've been raised in that kind of setting, which is very informal, and then you see Catholicism, its vestments, its Latin liturgy, lighting of candles, the Eucharist, and you see that it's got many centuries of establishment, there is an appeal there, whether you like Catholicism or not. There is an appeal to that. And I have said for many years that the Messianic community, if it could, up its game just a little bit, because we've got liturgy, right, from the synagogue. We've got a formal service with the Torah scroll and everything. We've got Hebrew. We've got a lot of things which are tactile, whether it's the appointed times, you've got the fall high holidays coming up, whether it's things like the Passover. We don't have to see people sucked into Catholicism. We could actually see some of our own numbers increase because that is what a lot of people are desiring, some kind of established formal religion which offers a sense of reverence and holiness to it. And unfortunately, Catholicism has been able to get a lot of Protestants to buy into that. Sorry. Probably won't be the last time we discuss this. Okay, from Rapid Response 47, this is from yesterday evening, forwarding on an article from the New York Post. Tulsi Gabbard strips 37 of security clearances over Obama-ordered intel report that launched Russiagate. Okay, so this Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, this concerns the Russiagate going back to 2016. Was there Russian interference in the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? She says, they aided and abetted in this action the seditious conspiracy that undermined our democracy, undermined our republic, and broke that sacred trust that every one of these professionals is supposed to have from the American people. And indeed, we should expect, certainly within the next month or so, as we approach the fall high holidays, situations like Russiagate, Epstein, they're going to come into greater focus. See, I am less concerned about people predicting falsely the pre-trib rapture, although we have this occur every year around the fall high holidays. I'm more concerned about the narrative here in America, people being called to testify, whether it's Russiagate, whether it's Epstein, whatever it is, and some of the instability and concern that is going to cause. I'm more concerned about that. Yes, I'm also concerned about Gaza, Russia, Ukraine. I'm concerned about those things with the fall high holiday season. Okay, our next story from Sean Hannity. Steve Witkoff takes us inside President Trump's high-stakes meeting with Putin in Alaska. So this is a minute and 13-second clip. According to Steve Witkoff, the special negotiator, there were concessions made almost immediately on the part of the Russians in the first meeting in Alaska. And part of getting those concessions was learning whether we were going to be able to see the Russians prepare to be more accommodating. That's a bit of intelligence that's really important for us to see, and the president fleshed that out almost immediately. Okay, so one of the things which a lot of commentators, a lot of political people have already noted is that if Vladimir Putin has any chance at all at being rehabilitated in the greater geopolitical spectrum, Donald Trump is his only chance. Donald Trump is the only one who, after this 3.5-year war, a lot of people don't even know what the causes of it are now. If Trump has any snowball's chance in you-know-where to be rehabilitated and go back onto the global scene, Trump is his only option. So, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the coming days, in the coming weeks or so, as a third summit of sorts is certainly being worked toward. From Newsmax today, August the 20th. Oh, I had to pass this along. Hillary Clinton, Supreme Court will repeal gay marriage like abortion. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is warning that during its next session, which begins October the 6th, the Supreme Court could do to same-sex marriage what it did to abortion. Let the states decide. Okay. Now, that's important to note because before gay marriage was legalized in the United States of America, it was already legal in many different states. Or somebody had to travel to Europe, a place like Iceland, for example, and a gay couple could be married, and then it had to be recognized as a marriage here in America. If gay marriage gets overturned, it's just going to go back to the states like abortion did. And so if somebody is married, a gay couple is married in one state, it would have to be recognized in another state which did not recognize gay marriage. Now, I live in the state of Texas. If gay marriage were to be overturned, I would fully expect the state of Texas to kill it. But I would also expect states like Texas, others in the Bible Belt, the conservative South, the Midwest, they would probably have to recognize a homosexual marriage which was performed in another state like California or New York or someplace like that. But we wait and see. I'm not optimistic about this one at all because unlike Roe v. Wade being overturned, which was something stated in the different Trump campaign promises going all the way back to 2016, you don't see gay marriage being overturned as something that they really were trying to push for. Okay, and our final story from Open Source Intel, August the 20th, early this morning, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said the bloc won't trust any deals with Russia and will keep sanctions while boosting Ukraine's defense. She added security guarantees aim to prevent Russia from regrouping. All right, so I saw this, and this is where we just have to recognize for the situation on the ground. Yes, pray for peace in Ukraine, pray for peace in Israel, continue to do that for certain. But while there is the Russian side, the Ukrainian side to this whole peace process, there's also the European side. And what are the Europeans going to be willing to do or not do regarding any kind of agreement? Are they just going to say, okay, so they've stopped fighting, but we're going to still keep all these different sanctions on Russia? Hey, this is the kind of thing which sadly could certainly delay, if not torpedo, some kind of a peace agreement. But continue to pray for peace. It's not impossible because you can't just see these people in Ukraine and Russia fight to the very last man. That's just not going to be possible. All right, so that finishes up our news roundup for today. For certain, we will see what happens tomorrow. And just to remind everybody, starting tomorrow, we're only going to be streaming this live on YouTube and X because during our broadcast, one of the other platforms cut out on us. And I even got a technical notification for that. So sorry about that. And of course, you can also listen to these episodes later, the audio, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, among others. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. I encourage you especially to visit our website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can find a wide number of free articles, frequently asked questions entries, back episodes of Messianic Insider, McKee Moment Shorts, and other teachings. I think you will greatly benefit from a visit. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.